last video, we learned that Joseph's brothers intended harm for him, but God did use it for good. Indeed, with God, there's always a meanwhile. But although God used it for good, there were consequences that had a compounding effect on many, many people. Actually, I want to show you how the brothers' unforgiveness and hatred toward Joseph played out for years and years and set off a chain of events that led to the entire nation of Israel being enslaved in Egypt. This is truly shocking. Unforgiveness, it will have a compounding effect in our life and in the lives of those that we interact with, far, far beyond what we even know. Future generations will be impacted by our choice today to forgive or not. So I want to continue in the story of Joseph, but go to a bit of a different place. Let's turn to Exodus and look at Exodus 1, starting in verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Okay, what happens here? Remember from last week, there was a famine in the land, and Joseph had been promoted to the second most powerful man behind Pharaoh in Egypt. Basically, Joseph got that promotion because when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream that there would be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, he proposed a strategy with such wisdom and clarity that Pharaoh decided he had the perfect candidate for this promotion in Joseph. So Joseph instructed Pharaoh that they needed to develop a system to save up the food that would be provided for them in the 7 years of plenty, so that during the 7 years of famine, starvation wouldn't wipe out the country of Egypt. So when the famine came, it not only reached Egypt, but reached all the extending lands, even all the way to Canaan, where Joseph's brothers were. And the brothers were sent by the father to come looking for food, and so did a lot of other people, because Egypt had provisions that other people didn't have. So his brothers wind up in Egypt, and many events unfold. There's a lot of back and forth, but eventually Joseph forgives them, and eventually they all plant themselves there in Egypt. They multiply, and they become the entire nation of Israel. Have you ever wondered when reading the story of Moses, how did all the Israelites become slaves in Egypt? Now don't get confused here, because I'm jumping now to the story of Moses. When we hear about Moses, we don't often connect him to the story of Joseph. But Moses and Joseph, they were very much connected. You see, the entire nation of Israel ended up as slaves in Egypt because of this verse right here. It says in verse 6, now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land, Egypt, was filled with them. That's Joseph and all his brothers and all their descendants. Exodus 1:8, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Yes, this is how the entire nation of Israel became slaves in Egypt. It was Joseph and all his brothers and all their descendants. That is the nation of Israel. And that's why, once they became enslaved, that the Israelites cried out to God for deliverance. And eventually, God rose Moses up to then go and deliver the people out of slavery and oppression in Egypt. This is the major story of the book of Exodus. But here's what I want to challenge you with. Go back and think about it. Where did this all start? The oppression of an entire country started all the way back in what we read last week, Genesis 37. I want you to look at this starting in verse 4. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. We see this again after Joseph reveals a dream to his brothers that he would eventually be their leader. Genesis 37:8. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then again, we see evidence of bitterness and unforgiveness in Genesis 37:19-20, as they plot to kill him. Indeed, their hurt had turned to hate. This is where it all started. What seemed to be just sibling rivalry and not that big of a deal outside of Joseph's family had multiplied consequences for future generations. Joseph's brothers' hatred and unforgiveness started a chain of events that would lead an entire nation to be slaves in Egypt. You see, this is what I really want us to think about today in our life. Sometimes we think that our decisions really don't impact too many other people. What we don't realize is there's never just a little bit of hate. There's never just a little bit of unforgiveness. There's never just a little bit of bitterness. All that mess gets multiplied, and it extends far wide and far deep. It has such far-reaching implications into future generations that we can't even see. Now, I want to show you this in an everyday kind of way. I don't know if you ever go through the drive-thru at Chick-fil-A to get some nuggets. My husband, Art, is the operator of a Chick-fil-A store. But let's just say you go and you get a sauce with your 8-pack of nuggets. That's costing Chick-fil-A about 15 cents. But most of the time, the people at the Chick-fil-A window, they're so generous. They're handing out 2 sauces for those 8 nuggets. Maybe, if you're anything like me, you have a whole bunch of these little sauces tucked in a drawer in your kitchen, or you have a little pile in your pantry of all these extra Chick-fil-A sauces. But let me show you the multiplied impact of those extra sauces. Every sauce that Chick-fil-A hands out is 15 cents. So if they have 1,500 orders in a day, and that's pretty realistic, let's do the math. If Art's employees give out 1 extra sauce per order a day, that is $225 a day in extra sauces. Now, they're open an average of 311 days in a year. So if I multiply out that added expense of 1 extra sauce being given per order that people probably are not even using, it will cost that one Chick-fil-A location $69,975 per year. And if they give out 2 extra sauces per order every single day, that's $450 a day, multiplied out over 311 days, and it will cost that one Chick-fil-A location $139,950 per year. That's right. That is the multiplied impact of just giving out some extra Chick-fil-A sauces that are sitting in people's kitchens and office drawers and piled up in pantries all over everywhere. Now, that's just for one Chick-fil-A location. If you really want to be mind blown, multiply that reality out by several thousand stores, and you can see there's a multiplied impact that takes place. You might think, Lisa, we're just talking about Chick-fil-A sauces. But I'm talking about the multiplied impact of unforgiveness in our life. When we make the decision to not forgive, it doesn't just affect us. There'll be a multiplied impact that really does extend far wide, far-reaching, more than we even know. So with Joseph's brothers, we get to see the results of the multiplied impact of their unforgiveness. But on the flip side of that, I want to show you Joseph's forgiving perspective and some of the blessings that ensued because he took that route. Let's look at what Joseph names his sons. This is something really interesting that we don't always hear about. How Joseph names his children shows so much about the multiplied impact of his choices. He names his sons Manasseh and Ephraim, meaning forgetful and fruitful. These names are such evidence of Joseph having a better perspective and a healed heart. First, let's unpack why Manasseh, meaning forgetful, is so telling. Joseph hasn't forgotten what was done to him. What his brothers did was still really hard, but he's choosing to let go of the bitterness. He's making wise choices throughout his story, even in the midst of circumstances that are less than ideal. Obviously, Joseph still has memory of what happened, because remember when we read Genesis 50:20, it clearly says, "You intended to harm me." He's still able to state the trouble that his brothers caused him, but he refuses to be enslaved by the facts of what happened. And then in the verses that I want to take you to, right after Genesis 50:20, it shows us he's choosing to be fruitful in less than ideal circumstances. Now, make no mistake, he's still living in the impact of his brother's choices. He's still in Egypt. He's still leading people, but it doesn't look like he imagined it would when God gave him that original vision all the way back when he was 17 years old. And even in the midst of all of that, he's able to recognize that it is possible to be fruitful and use what he's learned in the circumstances of his life to live in a healthy way and help other people. His God-honoring choices have a multiplied good impact for generations to come. God helped him forget, or actually just let go of all that troubled him so that it wouldn't paralyze him in his pain. And God helped him be fruitful so he could help others. The statement to remember this week is, it's hard to be fruitful while we're holding on to what's hurtful. Friend, I know whatever you have been through, it's hurtful. Me too. But letting God plant our hurt like a seed that produces fruit that helps others, brings such a purpose to our pain and brings our healing full circle. I also think it's important to point out that Joseph never gets to return to Israel, and there are parts of our story that will never be the same either. So let's go back to Genesis 50:20 and be reminded of what it says. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. But let's keep reading. Verse 21 says, so then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he, Joseph, reassured them and spoke kindly to them, to his brothers. Verse 22, Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knee. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph never let go of the dream to go back to his original home, but God didn't answer that promise before Joseph died. God has such an eternal perspective in this. Not everything was tied up in a bow by the time Joseph died, but the Israelites, they kept their promise to Joseph and carried his bones with the Ark of the Covenant even when they wandered the desert for 40 years. And when they finally made their way into the Promised Land, Joseph finally returned home. He's buried there today. Interestingly enough, right near the well his father built, Jacob's well. Was God faithful to Joseph? Yes. Did Joseph get everything he wanted? No. And the same may be true for us. But can God make our lives good? Yes. Yes, he can. So may we be a little more like Joseph today, a little more forgetful and a lot more fruitful.